Russia has a new strategy in the making. It is looking to deplete Ukraine's power generation capacity ahead of winter, hoping that the resulting blackouts will convince the Ukrainian leadership to surrender at the negotiating table. Since early October, Russia has used high-yield cruise missiles and Iranian-made loitering munitions to strike at Ukrainian power stations. More than 300 such attacks have been verified. Videos on social media show smoke rising from cities like Dnipro, Lviv, Zhytomyr, Kremenchuk, Khmelnytsky, Zaporozhye, and so on. The damage is substantial. About one-third of Ukraine's power generation capacity is knocked out. About 4 million civilians have been hit by power cuts, and the blackouts have affected the basic functions of the economy. At the same time, Russia is sending waves of drone attacks to intimidate Kiev from above. Combined with the blackouts, Putin hopes to wear down the Ukrainian population and force Zelensky to sue for peace. Routed, defeated, and facing enormous territorial losses in Ukraine, the Russian military command is increasingly running out of options. They want to win, regardless of the costs. And in such desperate times, it does not matter whether the cat is black, brown, or white, as long as it catches mice. Today's video was sponsored by Speakly, an app that helps you learn languages 5 times faster than what most people are accustomed to. While most apps teach you to understand each little part of the conversation, Speakly looks to immerse you in authentic content, so the way you absorb the language feels natural. According to Speakly, with only 30 minutes of daily practice, you can go from zero to solid speaking skills in 3-4 months. I've been using the app to brush on my Russian, which seems easy until you get to the advanced grammar. Having used Speakly, I appreciate the variety of studies. You learn new vocabulary and have speaking, listening, and writing exercises. But you also get surprisingly new methodologies like music recommendations. So the app never gets boring or monotonous. Speakly is available on both web and mobile. Click the link below and start learning some cool new languages today. Try for free for 7 days and get a 60% discount if you join the annual subscription. Air power is predominant, both as a deterrent to conflict and, in the eventuality of war, as a devastating operation to destroy an enemy's capacity to wage war. Regrettably, bombing civilians is one of the most common air strategies to this day. It is thoroughly embedded into military doctrines, and yet it is a flawed strategy, deeply so. The idea traces its roots to World War I, when Italian General Giulio Douhet theorized that air power could break the enemy morale. Douhet identified 5 strategic target types for aerial warfare: industry, transport, infrastructure, communications, and government. Supposedly, by striking at these 5 targets, the will of the enemy population would demoralize, and civilians would demand their government to surrender or cut deals to abandon territory. Air forces were still a new thing back then, and Douhet's theory fired up the imagination. It fit the "get tough" narrative, but it also inadvertently achieved one primal desire: revenge. Whenever conflict comes close to home, societies will want revenge for the actions of their rivals. Thus, public punishment and political victory sat at the heart of Douhet's air power theory, and every major power expanded its air forces with the assumption that attacking civilians was the key to winning modern conflicts. The air power theory directly and indirectly inspired civilian bombing campaigns during World War I, World War II, and all the armed conflicts that played out during the Cold War. And yet, there was one flaw to the theory. Never in history has there been a nation that, under the pressure from hostile bombardment, protested against its government to pursue peace. It has never happened. German bombers killed more than 40,000 people in London during World War II, while the American air raids on Japan killed more than 700,000 civilians. Yet neither nation pressured its government to surrender. During the Vietnam War, America dropped more than 260 million bombs on Laos, while during the Afghan War, the Soviet Union essentially depopulated the countryside through a scorched earth campaign. And yet, no civilian uprising ever took root in Afghanistan or Laos. Quite the opposite. In nearly all cases of civilian bombing, the targeted nation was actually motivated to counterattack and perceived the collateral damage as a price to pay for sovereignty and independence. Bombing civilian targets is a doomed strategy. It is almost guaranteed to fail because it actually strengthens the resolve of the targeted society. Russia's new air strategy to destroy Ukraine's power supply ahead of winter is no different. By destroying the electrical power of the civilian economy, other civilian utilities are also affected, including water supplies and centralized heating. So the damage multiplies across society. Putin hopes that by cutting off the Ukrainian population from water, electricity, and heating, Zelensky will concede at the negotiating table. The Russian Air Force is working around the clock to make that goal happen. Almost 1/3 of Ukraine's power generation capacity has been knocked out already. But Russia's strategy is also aimed at the West. First and foremost, it is meant to instigate a new wave of refugees from Ukraine into Europe. Officials in Kiev have asked Ukrainian refugees abroad not to return this winter because the energy network cannot endure. At the same time, Moscow looks to increase Europe's financial costs of supporting Ukraine. Historically, Ukraine has enjoyed an energy surplus. Now, however, it has started importing energy from Europe while its treasury is stretched thinly. To pay for the transaction, Ukraine needs to borrow between $3 and $4 billion every month from the IMF to make it through the coming winter. This sum could quickly inflate when considering additional costs like social and infrastructure needs. Meanwhile, Zelensky has asked foreign donors for $55 billion to cover the budget deficit, including $17 billion to repair the energy infrastructure. Taken together, these are some serious numbers, and European lawmakers will find it difficult to justify their commitments to Ukraine while their own constituents pay the financial price. And yet, ultimately, Russia's strategy will fail. History has plenty of examples, but the most similar is the Gulf War. The United States disrupted more than 90% of the Iraqi power grid, leaving millions of Iraqis without power. But regardless of how badly Iraqi society was wounded, they did not yield. No protest or uprising took place against Saddam's rule. The Russian command is using a tried and failed playbook. Dozens of energy installations have thus far been targeted, but a nationwide blackout in Ukraine is unlikely. Russia is believed to be lacking in munitions, and even if it could double its firepower and maintain the attacks, it would do no good. According to a nationwide poll conducted by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, at least 86% of respondents support Ukraine's continued counteroffensive in spite of the recent airstrikes against civilian targets. In short, there is no reason to assume that Russia's bombardment of civilian targets or energy infrastructure will convince Ukrainians to give up. Now, air power is still a decisive factor, but only when it is used in combination with ground forces to achieve military objectives rather than punishing civilians. Just compare the tactics of the Russian Air Force to that of Ukraine. The way to use an air force effectively comes down to the following. Ground forces need large numbers to withstand a ground assault, oftentimes forming thick and overlapping front lines. However, those large concentrations make for juicy targets from the air. So, as a countermeasure, ground forces will disperse across a wide area to make airstrikes less effective. This stand, however, leaves the thinly stretched ground forces vulnerable to defeat on the ground. That's how Ukraine was able to overwhelm the Russian front lines in Kharkiv. Ukrainian forces pinned down enemy contingents, while others routed enemy forces by a pincer move. This has been Ukraine's primary strategy in rolling back Russian forces in the east. Even the best dug-in Russian troops have been bested. The only tactical difference is that Ukraine tilted the battlefield in its favor not by use of an air force, but by HIMARS missile systems. The United States has provided Ukraine with 16 HIMARS, with another 18 on the way. Precision weaponry has advanced substantially in recent years. It is more affordable and readily available. Modern air power can destroy large concentrations of enemy ground forces, but also take out smaller and even individual targets on the battlefield. When applied correctly, as Ukraine does, the HIMARS have the firepower and effectiveness of several F-16 fighter jets. But since the HIMARS operate on the ground, they enjoy greater flexibility in coordinating with Ukrainian ground forces and thus can be used against the Russians in any given area. As a result, Ukrainian troops have been able to successfully encircle and overwhelm their Russian counterparts in Kharkiv and places elsewhere. So while the Russians employ an old, flawed air strategy, the Ukrainians are going by the new combined arms playbook. And while Russia can bomb Ukrainian cities and civilians as much as it wants, it will not change the battlefield. Russia's strategic failures in Ukraine cannot be fixed by brute force. 8 months into the war, and it's safe to say that Russia could have done things differently on many occasions. Nothing it did was inevitable, but everything has since become irreversible. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you like what we do, comment, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and Sağ ol.